Marcus had been dreaming of this day for years. He had worked hard, studied late into the nights, and finally earned his place as an FBI agent. Today was his first day at the field office, and he felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as he walked across the parking lot toward the entrance. He had a strong sense of purpose, knowing he had what it took to make a difference in the agency. As Marcus approached the building, he saw Officer Daniels standing guard at the entrance. Daniels was a white officer, older than Marcus, and had the appearance of someone who had been doing this job for years. His job was simple: check the IDs of anyone entering the building and ensure that only authorized personnel were allowed in. Marcus, walking with confidence, thought it would be an easy entry, but that was not what happened. Officer Daniels looked Marcus up and down, his gaze lingering for just a little too long. Something about the way he stared made Marcus feel uneasy. When he reached the door, Daniels suddenly stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Can I see your ID?" Daniels asked, his tone flat, almost cold. Marcus, taken aback, immediately reached for his badge and ID, showing them to the officer. He expected Daniels to step aside and let him in, but instead, the officer squinted at the badge, looking doubtful. "You sure you're supposed to be here?" Daniels asked, his voice sharp. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had been through the FBI's rigorous training program. He had been through background checks, interviews, and a million tests to get here. And now this officer was questioning his authority. It wasn't just the challenge. It was the way Daniels looked at him, like he didn't belong. The moment hung in the air, tense and uncomfortable, as Marcus tried to stay calm. His first day on the job was already turning into something he hadn't expected. Marcus stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. He had expected to walk in confidently, but now he was stuck in an awkward situation. Officer Daniels was still blocking the door, staring at him as if he was some sort of imposter. Marcus felt a wave of frustration wash over him, but he kept his emotions in check. He had learned from his training to remain calm, even in the most challenging situations. "I'm an FBI agent," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "You can check my credentials if you like." The officer didn't seem convinced. Daniels glanced down at the badge in his hand, but didn't immediately move. His eyes flicked up to Marcus, then to the front of the building, as if considering something. There was a moment of silence, and Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He had expected the officer to simply let him through, but instead, Daniels' skepticism was growing. "You sure about that?" Daniels asked again, his voice just a little more cold now. "I don't think I've seen you around here before." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had worked so hard to get here. The FBI wasn't a job you just walked into. It took years of dedication and sacrifice. And yet here he was, being treated like he didn't belong. He tried to explain again, his voice a little more insistent this time. "I'm on assignment. My supervisor is Special Agent Johnson. You can verify with him." Still, Daniels didn't seem to care. Instead, he pulled out his radio and started speaking into it, requesting confirmation. Marcus felt a growing sense of disbelief. How could this be happening? He could see a few other agents walking by in the background, noticing the scene, but none of them stepped in. It felt like he was being singled out for no reason, and the sting of it cut deeper than he expected. Marcus stood there, growing more frustrated with each passing second. The officer wasn't just doubting his credentials, it felt personal. He could feel the eyes of the other agents watching from the corners of the hallway, a few glancing nervously in his direction. Some looked away quickly, unsure if they should intervene or simply ignore the situation. It made Marcus feel even more isolated, as if no one was willing to step in and help. He took a deep breath and forced himself to stay calm. His training had prepared him for many things, but not for this. This kind of treatment. Marcus had always been aware of the prejudices people of color faced, but it still hurt when it happened to him, especially in a place like the FBI, a place where he had worked so hard to belong. He had earned his position, yet here he was, stuck at the entrance while a white officer questioned his every move. The officer, still standing in his way, looked at Marcus with a sort of quiet judgment. Daniel's hand hovered over his radio, waiting for confirmation, but Marcus could already tell the officer wasn't in any rush to verify his identity. The seconds felt like minutes, and each moment added to the weight of the situation. "Are you going to let me in?" Marcus finally asked, trying to remain polite, but feeling the tension rising in his chest. Daniels didn't answer immediately. He just continued staring at the badge, as if looking for something that wasn't there. Marcus knew he couldn't just stand there forever. He had a job to do, an assignment to complete. But he was stuck, caught between wanting to prove himself and the harsh reality of being judged by his skin color instead of his qualifications. The silence between them stretched longer, and Marcus realized that no matter how hard he tried, this moment wasn't going to resolve easily. The officer was looking for a reason to challenge him, and Marcus had no idea how much longer this uncomfortable standoff would last. Just as the tension between Marcus and Officer Daniels reached its peak, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Marcus looked up and saw Special Agent Johnson walking towards them. Johnson, a seasoned and well-respected officer, had a reputation for being both fair and tough. His presence was instantly commanding, and Marcus felt a small sense of relief wash over him. Johnson's eyes flicked quickly to the scene unfolding before him. He saw Daniels standing in front of Marcus, blocking his way, and immediately understood the situation. Without a word, he stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "Daniels," Special Agent Johnson said, his voice steady but carrying authority. "What's going on here?" Officer Daniels straightened up, looking slightly uncomfortable as he shifted his attention to Johnson. He stammered for a moment, not quite knowing how to explain the situation. I was just verifying if he belongs here," Daniels muttered, his voice lacking the confidence it had before. Johnson's gaze moved to Marcus, who was still standing with his arms crossed, trying his best not to show his frustration. The agent gave him a brief nod of acknowledgement, recognizing the discomfort Marcus must have been feeling. Johnson then turned back to Daniels, his expression becoming more serious. "I don't think that's necessary," Johnson said sharply. "This is Agent Marcus, and he's on assignment. Let him through." The words hit Marcus like a wave of relief. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he could move past this uncomfortable situation. He wasn't sure what to make of Daniels' actions, but the situation was finally being resolved. Officer Daniels didn't argue further. Instead, he mumbled an apology under his breath, avoiding eye contact with both of them. As he stepped aside, Marcus gave him one last look, feeling a mix of emotions. He didn't want to let this moment consume him, but he couldn't ignore the sting of what had just happened. Without saying another word, Marcus walked past the officer and entered the building, Special Agent Johnson following close behind. Even though he was now free to go about his day, the incident left a sour taste in his mouth. What should have been a simple entry into the office had turned into a reminder of the challenges he still faced. As Marcus walked through the halls of the office with Special Agent Johnson, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. His first day was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to prove himself. But instead, it had been overshadowed by that uncomfortable interaction with Officer Daniels. Marcus felt a mix of anger and disbelief, but he was also trying hard to push those feelings aside. There was no time to dwell on what had happened. He had a job to do. Johnson kept pace beside him, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hall. The older agent's presence was reassuring, but Marcus couldn't shake the thought that the day had already been tainted by what had occurred at the entrance. Johnson broke the silence, his voice calm but with a hint of concern. "Don't let that get to you, Marcus," he said, his tone almost fatherly. "People like Daniels, they don't represent the whole department. I've been through similar situations myself. It's hard, but you have to keep going." Marcus nodded, appreciating the words, but they didn't make the sting of the moment go away. He had grown up hearing stories about racism and prejudice, and now, here he was, facing it firsthand in a place where he had worked so hard to be accepted. It didn't seem fair, and for a brief moment, Marcus found himself wondering if it was something he'd always have to face, no matter how much he accomplished. "Thanks, Johnson," he said quietly, trying to focus on what the agent was saying. "I just don't understand why it had to happen today. I've worked so hard to get here." Johnson looked over at him, his eyes softening. "I know you have, and that's exactly why you need to brush it off. The work we do is bigger than this. People like Daniels, they don't matter. What matters is that you're here for a reason, and you belong just like anyone else." The words were comforting, but Marcus still couldn't forget the look in Daniel's eyes. It wasn't just doubt. It was something deeper, something more ingrained. But he knew Johnson was right. He couldn't let it stop him. Marcus had worked too hard to get here. And today, despite everything, he was still going to prove himself. As Marcus sat down at his desk in the bullpen, the weight of the earlier encounter still lingered in his mind. The hum of activity around him, the sound of phones ringing, agents talking, and computers clicking, felt distant, like it was happening in a world separate from his own. He tried to focus on his work, but every time he glanced at the door or heard someone walk by, his mind would wander back to the scene at the entrance. The truth was, he had hoped that entering the FBI would mean escaping the small-town prejudices he had grown up with. He had hoped for a fresh start, a place where his skills and dedication would define him, not the color of his skin. But now, sitting at his desk in one of the most prestigious law enforcement agencies in the country, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle he had fought to get here wasn't over. It had just taken a new form. As the day went on, Marcus pushed those thoughts aside. He focused on the assignments in front of him, scanning through files, reviewing cases, and taking notes. The work was challenging, but it was also exciting. He loved the feeling of solving puzzles, uncovering the truth, and making a real difference in the world. But despite the importance of his work, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. It wasn't until late afternoon that something shifted. Johnson came over to his desk with a small smile, his tone lighter than before. "Hey, Marcus," he said, leaning on the edge of the desk. "I know you're probably still thinking about what happened earlier, but I want you to know something. You handled it well. I've seen people let stuff like that get to them, but you kept your cool. That's what matters." Marcus looked up at Johnson, a little surprised. The weight of the day had started to feel a little easier now that he had a moment of reassurance. He nodded slowly, appreciating the support. "Thanks, Johnson," Marcus replied, his voice a little stronger. "I guess I just want to prove that I belong here. I won't let one person's actions define me." "That's the spirit," Johnson said with a grin. "You belong here more than anyone, and I'm glad you're part of the team." As Marcus sat back in his chair, he finally felt like the day wasn't a complete setback. The fight wasn't over, but he was starting to feel more confident in his ability to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He wasn't going to let a single moment or one officer's mistake change his path. This was just the beginning. The following weeks at the office weren't easy for Marcus, but they were a constant reminder that he was more than just his skin color or the prejudices others might hold. He threw himself into his work with even more determination, pushing through the discomfort he sometimes felt when he saw certain agents avoid eye contact or whisper behind his back. But he refused to let those small moments shake his resolve. Each day, he focused on the job, getting closer to proving himself not just to the people around him, but to himself as well. Despite everything, Marcus began to notice something changing in the way people treated him. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but soon enough, a few of his colleagues started offering him support. Johnson was always there, checking in on him and giving him the confidence boost he needed. But others, too, began to warm up to him. They respected his work ethic and his ability to get things done under pressure. Slowly, Marcus began to feel like he was becoming part of the team, like he was earning the respect he had always hoped for. One afternoon, a breakthrough came when Marcus was called in to help with an important case. It was one of the highest-profile investigations the office was handling, and his expertise was crucial. As he sat in the conference room, reviewing evidence and offering suggestions, Marcus could see the respect in the eyes of his colleagues. No one questioned his abilities or doubted his place in the room. For the first time since he had started, he truly felt like he belonged. Later that evening, as Marcus sat alone in his office wrapping up the day's work, he thought back to the incident with Officer Daniels. At that moment, he had felt as if the world was against him. But now, after everything he had done to prove himself, he realized that one person's actions didn't define him. What mattered was his work, his character, and his unwavering commitment to the mission. The truth was, Marcus was just getting started. He had much more to offer, and the challenges ahead only motivated him to keep going. What he had learned was that no matter how tough things got, his strength came from within. He wasn't going to let anything hold him back. He was a part of this team, and no one could take that away from him.